It's Matt from Noetic. You may remember me from such uncompleted series, such as Kant's Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason. And joining me is CJ.
Yes.
Who is in everything Noetic.
Every other thing.
Every other thing?
Every other two things.
So CJ, what are we talking about today?
Man, we're going to be talking about more. Thomas More's Utopia.
See, I thought you were just going to say more. We're talking about more. Just more stuff.
Well, it is more stuff.
It is more stuff. On Noetic. Download the app now.
But yeah, no, I think we're doing the first part of Thomas More's Utopia today. And I know, at least this year, in the year 2016, what is it, the 500-year anniversary of the original
It is.
publication?
It is. Actually, December 1516 was when Utopia was released. And released to the English world and provided the English world with the word Utopia.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that was the origin of it.
It was the inauguration of the word Utopia in the English language.
Ooh.
That was the smoother thing I was going to try to say.
Well, I'm glad that we're finally doing it on such a momentous occasion, and for a work that introduced us to the word. That's wonderful. So where are we going to start out with? Are we going to start with a certain background? I know you had something.
Yep. Well, we want to establish who Thomas More is first. Yeah. So Sir Thomas More, was born in 1478 or 1477. There's actually some dispute on that.
Oh, gosh.
But died in 1535 when he was... he's now considered a martyr by the Catholic Church, but he was killed by the King of England, which we'll talk about in a second. Mm-hmm. But More was an English lawyer, a social philosopher, author, statesman, a Renaissance humanist. He was the counselor of Henry VIII, and he was the Lord High Chancellor of England from 1529 to 1532.
And that'll get a lot of attention, at least in the first book, at least Counseling Kings. So
yeah, exactly. More was opposed to the Protestant Reformation, and in particular the theology of Martin Luther and William Tyndale. He opposed the separation of England from the Catholic Church and refused to acknowledge Henry as the head of the Catholic Church or the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And after refusing to take the oath of supremacy, he was convicted of treason and beheaded. He was canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1935, and then Pope John Paul II in 2000 declared him the heavenly patron of statesmen and politicians.
So I think, at least with that, it almost sounds like Utopia would take on religious undertones, I suppose.
Of course,
but,
they're present throughout the book.
Yeah,
but subtly. I feel like they don't come across strongly.
Yeah, that's what I figured, because it seems more about political. I guess when we think of Utopia or utopian, anything regarding that, it has to do more with this idea of a commune or some kind of political structure that is ideal or anything like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think the thing maybe we need to note first as well is that this is a work of fiction, so we're not just dealing with this is what a utopia is like, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, A, we're not dealing with that. We're dealing with a story. At least I don't know if you can get into that a little bit, how it's sort of
absolutely. So this is a discourse on an ideal commonwealth, and so in some ways I think it was the editors of my Cambridge volume who describe it as a best Commonwealth exercise done according to Greek rules.
So a thought experiment in some respect.
That challenges the social imaginary of England at the time and probably reveals something of the struggle within More himself. Because while More is present in the story, Hythloday in some ways is standing in for More as well. There's this interplay between these two halves of More going back and forth. Which actually leads us into another thing about this work is that it's an ironic discourse. There's a heavy dose of irony throughout, and we see this even in the name Utopia, which means no place. And in the name Hythloday, Raphael Hythloday, whose last name means nonsense peddler. So he's the nonsense peddler talking about no place. Now, Hythloday is important because it's through Hythloday that we learn about Utopia to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so he's described in the work as being the first person, the first European to circumnavigate the globe. And then Magellan actually did that later. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Hythloday represents this other half of More's mind. In some ways, you almost see this play of, because Plato, Aristotle, different Roman thinkers like Cicero, Seneca come up in this text a lot. And so you see More playing off the practical Aristotelian side of what's actually possible in the world we have versus this Platonic side of him in Hythloday, who's trying to show this ideal and then say, no, this ideal isn't just an ideal, it's possible to do now. One other thing to note is that this book is actually an expansion of actual conversations between Thomas More and his friend Peter Giles, who appears in the work as a character. But so you have it based on on real conversations, but then More has given it this fictional flair.
Oh, that's wonderful. So let's see how More brings in Hythloday and how they start this conversation, I suppose.
Certainly. I did want to point out real quick that we are going to skip past the greeting that Thomas More gives to Peter Giles. So he starts off with a greeting to Giles about how he wants Giles to get in touch with Hythloday to make sure that the account is as it should be. And he actually makes an interesting point that will come back around at the transition to book 2, where he talks about how much he thinks people despise learning, how most people despise doing what it takes to learn. Sometimes they consider real learning too difficult. Sometimes they only read ancient writers and they can be kind of snobs about what they read or how they learn. And that issue of being willing to learn and being willing to learn new things is going to come back around at the transition at the end of the chapter. One final introductory note is that initially when this book was written, many people believe that it was written as only book 2. So the description of Utopia, but then More adds in book 1, and you can actually find the seam where that is in page 12 of my edition, the Cambridge edition. Towards the bottom of page 12, he says, "These I shall discuss in another place, as I said. Now I intend to relate only what he told us, Hythloday, about the customs and institutions of the Utopians." And right there would have gone into the book 2. But then he says, but first recounting the conversation that drew him into speaking of that Commonwealth, which is ultimately a critique of England, which we'll get into now.
Yeah, and that will give us some clarity. Hopefully after discussing it today, maybe we can find out why he would have introduced that before getting into Utopia. Maybe, like you said, to have a foil for Utopia to say, oh, well, this is how it is and this is how it could be.
Right.
So that'd be great. Yeah, so let's
dive in.
Let's dive in. So we start off with More, and he gives a little introduction to where he's at, why he's there, who he's with. Do you remember much of that? I feel like it's a little fuzzy for me.
I do. It starts off with the question where More and Giles ask Hythloday why he doesn't put himself in service to the king.
Sure, and I guess, and then we have, isn't it just Giles and More just hanging out, and then they find out about this traveler who has gone across the world and see all these great things, and he's this wise adventurer named Raphael Hythloday, and then they're just like, whoa, this guy, I don't know if they're awestruck, I can't remember, but it seemed like they were awestruck about him, and then that's where they ask that question, like, why aren't you helping kings or anything like that?
And it's interesting because the suggestion comes up that there's this distinction between the active and the contemplative. And with Hythloday noting, I think this is 14 of my edition, that princes are more interested in war than peace, and advisors are not interested in considering different ideas because they are self-interested. Which leads into a story where Hythloday recounts a conversation he had with John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury and Cardinal, and at that time Lord Chancellor of England, who I believe More, it actually says, had
actual relations with.
Well, at least respect and an admiration for him.
Oh, okay.
So the conversation begins with the question concerning penalties for theft. And the question becomes one of why there are so many. So this is recounting the conversation that takes place at the table of the Archbishop. And so the conversation becomes one of why there are so many thieves springing up everywhere.
Yeah, even after we have put them to death and, we think like, oh, that's going to cure the problem, but they keep popping up.
And so the issue becomes, and Hythloday challenges this death as an effective deterrent of stealing. And he talks about how people are driven to the necessity of stealing. But then the layman who's there listening responds with these words, page 16 of my edition. He says, "Oh, we've taken care of that. There are the trades and there is farming by which men may make a living, unless they choose deliberately to do evil." And how does Hythloday respond to that?
He says, No, he's like, what about the invalids? What about the people that are too old to learn a craft? What about the people that have injured themselves so they can't work? So there are these limitations that people can't do these trades that the one layman responds with. So,
and then in addition to that, Hythloday goes on to criticize the number of lordly retainers and nobles that surround the wealthy. And he says that these are idle and they are a waste of resources.
No, exactly. And I think there was a part too about serving men, or at least the people that help these noblemen becoming thieves, because they don't know, they haven't really learned a trade or anything. They've just been there. And then, when the nobleman dies, what do they do? Or when they get out of their job of being the serving men, what are they going to do but be thieves? So there's this idea of like idleness, I think, for Hythloday that brings about some sort of thievery, or at least that like, well, I got nothing else to do and I need food and money, so I need to steal or something like that.
Which there's an interest before he transitions to the comments about the wool trade and the sheep enclosures, which we'll talk about. He again makes one final comment about the retainers being an economic drain, and he says that princes don't need such a large standing army because they don't have war unless they seek it, and that peace should be sought instead. It almost seems like a relevant contemporary debate.
Yeah.
The resources that go into war versus those that into war, and as well as this issue of having the resources available to those who might have trouble finding work, maybe to those who aren't capable of supporting themselves. So I think of even things like, he uses the word invalid, but even people with disabilities and resources available for them, which I'm thankful we have in this country, but we do have this issue of like we have this huge wartime, we have this huge military budget even in peace times. But what about having resources available for those who either have trouble finding work, are incapable of working because of mental illness or something else?
And even to go off of that too, this idea of that when soldiers are in peacetime, what are we going to do with them? And that's one part that more, I think, maybe it's a little later, but talks about this idea of, okay, or at least Hythloday says, okay, well, most of the, we're not in war 24/7, 365. There's peacetime, but if these soldiers have nothing else to do, then they're just going to cause maybe chaos, but maybe in our respect, even to our time too, where, there is a concern about veterans finding work after they go into battle, and some of them are invalid, or at least like disabled from combat or mental issues as well, so there's that to play into it too.
Well, and that goes into questions about support for things like, even for homeless, a lot of homeless people suffer from mental illness, and that's why they're homeless. But it seems like even in this question of harsh penalties, it seems like there are times where we would rather jail people than provide them mental health services. So, yeah, I found this issue of resources for war and support of the invalid, and the weak and this issue of harsh penalties for those who are already economically depressed, who are driven to crime. I mean, think about even mass incarceration. Mm-hmm. Like people who are trying to, in some ways make a living through, selling weed or something.
Right.
But then they're, sent to prison on these 3 strike rules and other things that really don't match the crime.
Right. Exactly. So then it becomes a matter of, okay, well, how do we support that? Or how do we try to create some kind of government where we can keep that under control, but at the same time give people free, like this controlled, constrained freedom? I don't really know how to describe it any further, but at least going even on to that, I think Moore sees this problem with closing off property, or at least well, I guess we get the sheep masters, or at least the people that close off the land as part of that problem that we're discussing here.
Land that could have been farmed by multiple workers.
Right.
But then something more economically viable at the time comes up, so you just enclose it to use for sheep. Mm-hmm. And in the process, you have this wool trade controlled by very few. So people are driven to steal. Right,
and then there's this decay of husbandry where, people take more than they should, and like you said, it's just a small minority while the majority is left idle. I think there's an interesting part too where he extends I don't know if it's an analogy, or I guess it's quite literally, sheep and doing all that, but I think he extends it to cattle as well, where he says these rich pluck cattle from overseas, so nobody's actually learning how to raise cattle or anything like that, because they just buy it overseas at a cheap price and then sell it at a higher rate. But it's still that closed off sort of land and market that...
I love what he says. He says, where exactly does he say it? I wrote it down here. This issue that we make people thieves and then punish them for it. We take away the circumstances in which they can thrive. Mm-hmm. They're driven to desperation, and then we punish them for their acts of desperation.
Right.
And then we make them live side by side with the wanton luxury of others.
It's so true.
Oh, and on that note, he does make this comment about restricting the rich. Mm-hmm. Restricting the right of the rich to buy up anything and everything.
Yeah, and that's something he goes on later too when he talks about, we'll get to it, but the kings and how maybe they should have a limit of the wealth that they have. Mm-hmm. Because, you want to rule rich people. Like, I think it was, I can't remember who said it or who Hythloday quotes, but it's something like, a king would rather, I guess as a king you would rather rule over prosperous people than poor. So there's that sort of element too,
and that's something we'll definitely get to, because there are some interesting comments about how some people view poverty, poverty creating a docile population. Mm-hmm. Which was fascinating.
Yeah.
So
we have this idea of private property creating these dearths. I think that Hythloday talks about, even of food and I guess he says victuals, but even of food, that since everything is limited to a minority, that the price rises and people can't buy the food or maybe the sheep or the wool that they could have, but it only goes to a select few of people that can afford it. And yeah, it just seems like it's all stemming from this idea of
which we might be getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, I'm getting a little excited.
Because we do move on, though. They get into a conversation about the equitable punishment for theft. What would equitable punishment look like?
We come to, yeah.
And it's actually interesting. On 21, he actually makes a comment about how we should not accept the Stoic decree that all crimes are equal, which is interesting. Because in some ways you have to wonder, it almost sounds like a Protestant idea of all crimes being equal. Some of the Christian discourses of James where one crime, I'd be curious to know what influence is playing. So there's the Stoic view, how that influences maybe James, because James is famous for if you break one law, or James.
Mm-hmm.
The New Testament, if you break one of the laws, you break them all. So you have to wonder how much Stoicism and Christianity kind of are informing this punishment for. I'd be curious to know.
No, I would be curious to know too, for sure.
But there's this problem of what is an equitable punishment for theft, and I found it interesting. Hythloday brings up the law of Moses, and it's like, look, the law of Moses, which was a harsher law,
still
just gave a fine.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, he goes on to say that in some ways we encourage murder by making the penalty.
I love this part.
The penalty for theft the same as murder, because then it's better to kill the person than get caught stealing.
Exactly, because you have to get rid of the evidence. You're like, well, I might as well just kill him if it's the same thing. And to even go back to the Moses part 2, I think Hythloday brings
Moses part 2.
Is the idea of, well, if God commandeth us not to kill, and yet we make an exception, then what else can we make an exception for? So there's that idea as well, where it's just like, okay, we're going against even this harsh law, the harsh law of Moses. So if we can bypass God's will and rule over us, then what else can we do?
I do like how the religious language in Utopia, how it's never over the top.
Yeah,
like it's brought in very because we're going to talk about another one soon, the New Testament. Like he quotes the New Testament later on, but in quoting the Hebrew Bible, it's just interesting the subtle ways that he's critiquing a culture that considers itself Christian, using Christian scripture to reveal the non-Christianly ways their society is structured.
Yeah, and it's subtle, but it's piercing though at the same time, where it's enough just to say, "Oh, okay, well, that's a little hypocritical."
So he uses the example. So the issue of what punishment would be bad, like he does this a few times throughout. This is one of those times where he brings up a people that doesn't exist to critique culture. So he called the Polyurites, meaning the people of much nonsense.
Yes, another one of those great little tricks. I love it.
Do you remember how he describes the Polyurites?
It was so, to me, it was humorous, but it's just that, well, they're quite peaceful, and then I'll quote more, saving that they pay a yearly tribute to the great king of Persia. So it's like they're still controlled people, but they're very happy, and they don't really experience war because they're enclosed, and they're comfortable rather than grand. They're peaceful people, but besides having to pay a yearly tribute so they don't get decimated by Persia, they're fine. They're good people. I mean, I don't know. I found that ironic twist, or at least the humor that you were alluding to in the beginning, kind of coming out, and even in the name, much nonsense. It is.
So how do they punish criminals?
Oh, that's a complex. Maybe we both have to take this because it's rather complicated. At least it starts off with they have to pay back the person that they stole from, right? Or at least that's the initial punishment, that they shouldn't be having to pay the king. It shouldn't be to the right of the king that you should be paying back your, whatever you stole. It should be the person. So that's the first part of it. And then I think, if you can't do that, then you are put into bondage, or I guess you're condemned to be a common laborer. That's the...
I believe it's all the rest is... I think it's actually... It says all the rest is handed over to his wife and children, while the thief himself is sentenced to hard labor.
Okay, so it's still... So that's just two parts of it, so it's not one or the other. Okay.
Which, he's uncomfortable. I believe he's not shackled or imprisoned. He goes free and unconstrained about his work on public projects. Mm-hmm. You can whip them.
Yes, I love that part. Yeah, it is also lawful for them to chastise the sloth of these serving men with stripes. So I guess like with whips. Yeah, I love that.
And they can be helped. But how?
But what's the limit? Yeah.
How? And I found this interesting. What happens? Why doesn't anyone try to escape?
Yeah, there's these limitations that are put on. Well, one is that they're all uniformly dressed, and then they all have the same haircut and the same part of their ear that's been chipped off or at least cut off. So they can't necessarily escape because they don't have any other clothes, so people are going to know that they're the servant. And then Hitler brings up the idea of conspiracy, that, maybe they'll all get together and conspire a revolt. But then another limitation is that they can't even talk to the other slaves of another part of town, or I think even to each other, period.
Well, and there's this issue of the rewards for informers are so high. A slave gets their freedom, and a free man gets money. And if you are caught colluding or trying to escape, the penalty is death, I believe.
Yes, it is death. So there is these limits so that they're not going to escape, like you said. Which
is interesting. This will be a theme that's subtle throughout the work, but it's this idea of the lack of privacy, which keeps secrecy and conspiracy from happening. It's subtle. You see it in book 2. You'll see it in book 2. This idea of secrecy preventing social upheaval, societal.
Yeah, that's what I was fascinated about in this description too, is that even though they are putting in these checks to make sure that people don't escape, there seems to be this, like you said, no privacy. Doesn't really seem to be quote unquote freedom as we know it. And yet it is in the service of bettering society. And there's this, it just seems to be this friction, at least in my mind, between like, is that right? Even though Hitler's like, but this is actually really good because it respects the individual.
Which I think the editors note that for a society like Moore's, it might not have seemed as extreme as it might to us.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because too much freedom leads to lack of stability in society.
Right.
So there's a little bit of a social thing happening that it is outside. This is one of those moments where you read an ancient text and go, this is way weirder to me because it's out of my context. Like,
right, you had to think the
I'm
period
not the
reader.
audience.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, so we have these limits, and yeah, that's the. I don't know if there's anything more about that system that you wanted to bring up.
Just that there's this comment that is made that the aim of punishment. First, Hitler notes how mild and practical the Polyurites are, and then notes that the aim of punishment is to destroy vices and save men. That's the ultimate aim of punishment, not just pure retribution, and definitely not excessive retribution.
Sure. And that alone is fascinating to think about even today, when we think, okay, what is justice? What is the penal system, right? I mean, is it to inflict justice, or is, like you said, is it to make men better in some respect that maybe have made a wrong decision or two? So that's...
We expect virtue of people, but I'm not sure our societal structures, our legal system, our justice system, our economic systems, I'm not sure if they encourage virtue. And I'm not sure...
Do you think Moore's example, or Hitler's example of the Polyurites shows virtue in any way to how they punish, quote unquote, punish the...
I'm not sure if I'd say that. I would say that because Aristotle is informing Moore, that I think Moore is seeing... Moore believes in the need for virtue as a part of how we construct the Commonwealth, which isn't something we necessarily really emphasize in the modern world as much, because we don't want to give people a telos or a good that they need to seek, a virtue they need to seek, because it violates sort of some of the libertarian free market narratives that shape us.
Freedom, going back to that freedom idea. So you think even the Polyurites, in some respect, are following a sense of dignity to have towards those people that commit these crimes of theft.
They have virtues that they obviously want people to strive towards.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So then the lawyer, sits there here in Hitler's store, and he's like, "Nah, can't happen."
Good transition.
Nah, this can't happen.
That was good. It was subtle. It was smooth. It was almost like in Utopia, how book 1 gets immersed in before book 2. Like, that was very smooth. So yeah, now tell me, what did this lawyer say?
Nah. Well, if I want to quote him, he said, "Nay, This could never be so established in England. On and on and on and on. But then we get the cardinal, right? And he kind of says, well, it could, I suppose, if you maybe put a limit. If a guy was going to be condemned to death, you could hold that off and see if it could work. Mm-hmm. Right?
And then he says he wants to do it with... We could do it with vagabonds, too.
Bring in the vagabonds. Why not? They can get into this experiment as well. And then everybody agrees, right? That's the funny part, where all the flatterers at first are like, Hitler, you're a bunch of BS. But then after the cardinal says, oh, yeah, we could try it, and they're like, oh, wise decision, sir. That's so great. We should do that.
Do we want to talk about the fight between the friar and the fool? Other than that, there's this fight between this fool who's standing nearby, and there's this friar who he's making fun of. The friar gets mad. The cardinal says, chill out, and kind of keeps the fool from... He doesn't really rebuke the fool, and everyone notices.
Just provoking it, yeah, just keeping it going. And doesn't he dismiss the fool shortly after?
I think so.
And that's where Hythloday has to say, and I'll quote, it's really funny, he says, look, Master Moore, with how long and tedious a tale I have kept you, which surely I would have been ashamed to have done, but that you so earnestly desired me, and did after such a sort give ear unto it, as though you would not that any parcel of that communication should be left out. Like, he just, like, gives this long-winded, even to say, like, sorry I talked so long, he has to give a long-winded explanation of that. I don't know, but...
The irony is deep with this one.
I know. So
one interesting thing, too, about the end of that conversation is that there's the note about how he wants to emphasize again how the king's courtiers wouldn't value his advice.
Yeah.
And then that's something Moore picks up again, trying to convince him, like, no, he basically is like, Hythloday, they need you.
Yes, and that's the transition that after he says, like, I'm sorry I talked your ear off, Moore says, well, look, I understand that you have this grievance against being a councilman, but you should still do it anyway. Still be that philosopher that could, I think as Moore says, vouchsafe to instruct kings with their good counsel. So there is still this insistence, and then
And he uses Plato, and he says that, it's good for philosophers to be in the court of kings. Mm-hmm. But Hythloday's response is, well, the kings themselves need to be philosophers.
Yep, and not all of them are Marcus Aurelius or anything like that, so...
Isn't there a rain analogy that you really love here? Is it here?
Yeah, it'll come soon.
Okay, great. So, they give the example of, I didn't catch the name of but he talks about the Ancorians. Mm-hmm. So there's this other made-up group he talks about, and it had to do with this issue of not going to war with Italy because France itself was already too big for one man to run. Mm-hmm. So he uses this example of the Ancorians as this foil for why France shouldn't go to war with Italy.
Right, because he's talking about counseling. It's like, okay, well, say for instance, I'm the Council of France, right? And that everybody's just saying, we should go to war. And he says, but wait, I'm going to say, oh, no. Let's do this instead. And you can go on,
But basically the issue is, like, if you were to say, let's not go to war, how well would that advice be received? And the conclusion is not too well.
Yeah, Moore's like, nah.
So then there are other issues that get brought up where the king can basically bring things out in his favor. Judges can muddy a clear issue by citing obscure exceptions or obscure cases to undo and muddy justice. And then they get to this section we mentioned earlier, this issue of poverty and rulership. Mm-hmm. And we talked about it earlier, this idea that there are those who believe poverty dulls the spirits of the common people, which keeps them docile and the king safe. So that's why the king should have most of the wealth. That's why the wealthy should have most of the wealth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he says, well, he has an objection to that, right?
Yep. Because
this wealth that the king does get, it is almost always, if not always, at the expense of the poor, right? And that's what he brings up again and again and again. He says, well, I think, who is it? Fabricius, I believe, where he says, when he said that he had rather be a ruler of rich men than be rich himself. So this idea that, well, if I'm the only one that's wealthy and everybody else is miserable, then there doesn't seem to be any justice to that.
And he says that poverty won't keep the peace, and that experience shows otherwise.
Yeah.
And in this process, too, he uses another made-up group, the Macarians, to bring home this point.
Yeah, they have that law for the king, right? That they
can't get more than 1,000 pounds.
Of gold or silver. And that keeps them in check. And that keeps them in check from greed at the people's expense, right? So then, well, that should be fine. You know, people should have their own money for their own business, for the market, or for just general well-being and wealth. So,
which ultimately, though, and Hythloday decides, he says all this, and then he brings up again that there's no place for philosophy in the Council of Kings, so you can't present these views.
Right. He says, no, they're not going to listen. He's like, yeah, again and again and again, they will not listen. But then Morse proposes a different. He's like, wait, you're being too black and white about this. I think he calls it another school of philosophy, which is this more pragmatic view of, well, we can work within it, right? I don't know if you can extend on it, but that we can work within
we can make it
this corrupt system.
We can make it as little bad as possible.
Yes, I love that. Like, oh, not too bad, but
you can't pull the problem up by the root. You can't go to the root. You have to make what's there as little bad as possible. Because it's impossible to make everything good unless all men are good, or human beings. Excuse me. But he advises, in order to do this, you have to use, and the Kierkegaardian in me loves this. You have to use the indirect approach. You have to kind of do it indirectly, not directly say what needs to be done. Versus Hythloday, who's like, no, you just need to proclaim the truth. Like, I can't. He disputes the indirect approach.
And this is where he brings in Christ's doctrines, right? Because he says, well, then these people bring in Christ's rule and they distort it further. Even though they bring it in to the Council of Kings, it becomes distorted and we're left with these doctrines that are not applicable or even similar to what Christ taught us.
I think, it's interesting the line of Hythloday's thought, because he says, the only result, if you try to make things a little less bad, will be that I will try to cure the madness of others. Is that while I try to cure the madness of others, I'll be raving along with them myself.
Yes.
And then he talks about, this is where he really starts hammering home how private property is the problem. It's what causes injustice. And to the response, well, that's absurd, you can't do away with this, he goes, well, what about the teachings of Christ? Those are way more absurd than the utopians getting rid of private property. So, if you're going to follow the ways of Christ, those are way more perverse to our customs.
And that goes right to your Kierkegaard self too, right? Or the radicalness of Christ's teachings, that we forget that sometimes.
I mean, this could be right out of that when he says, but this could be out of the moment. When he says, but preachers, like the crafty fellows they are, have found that people would rather not change their lives to fit Christ's rule. And so following your advice, I suppose, they have adjusted his teaching to the way people live.
Yep. No, exactly.
And the only real thing they accomplish that I can see is to make people feel more secure about doing evil. Which is great.
I know. They're framing evil in the manners of Christ's teachings, which is what Hythloday concludes is the catch-22 of being a counsel to kings or trying to give them advice, is that, like you said, either way, I think I'll quote him, he says, for either I must say otherwise than they say, and then I were as good to say nothing, or else I must say the same that they say, and help to further their madness. And exactly what you were quoting. So, and
then he says he wouldn't stand a chance with the indirect, because he's also like, I could be branded a traitor if I disagree. And there's your indirect approach doesn't work.
Exactly, it's a catch-22. So he can't necessarily do what Moore is advising, which is fascinating because we're dealing with Moore, who is a counsel in real life to the king, and he has to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. So I don't really know what to think, because we do have Moore, the person that is doing this, and then, like you said, maybe the ideal part of him that's saying, well, maybe what I'm doing isn't, maybe it isn't right. And I find that dichotomy in his head, just to think that maybe he's thinking that of himself, that guilt is really striking.
Moving on to this private property issue.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. He really gets... Oh, goodness.
It's so huge. He has this quote on page 37. Wherever you have private property, and money is the measure of all things, it is hardly ever possible for a commonwealth to be just or prosperous, unless you think justice can exist where all the best things are held by the worst citizens, or suppose happiness can be found where the good things of life are divided among very few, where even those few are always uneasy, and where the rest are utterly wretched. So again, he sees this... I love it's like money as the measure of all things. We were talking earlier about Marx and the critique of capitalism. And again, Marx didn't want to undo capitalism entirely. He wanted it to be sublated and the good things of it remaining, while more needed to be something else needed to be added.
Yeah.
And for that, it's interesting. He talks about how among the utopians, virtue has its reward, yet everything is shared equally and everyone lives in plenty. So this idea of virtue, that not living in a... And I think this is a contemporary critique, that in modern society where we can't encourage virtue, because that would give people... Because we live in a society of rights, not goods. And virtue is a good.
Yeah.
And so to encourage a good is to then impose upon people's rights and freedom. But it's by virtue, but we more saying we need virtue, and the utopians have virtue. But in a society of rights, and especially in a neoliberal society, money is the measure of all things. Success, profit is the measure. And this is where Marx's critique of capitalism is so interesting, because he says that, once upon a time, he compares Aristotle's time, and he says, Aristotle, at least in Aristotle's time, there were slaves and there were masters, but at least the master, in the free time that he had, used it to contemplate philosophy, science, and the arts. Nowadays, and he compares, he talks about wage labor as a form of slavery of types to the capitalist and whatnot. But the point is that even in the leisure time in our modern society, we don't use our leisure time to be involved in philosophy, science, and art. We use, if we're a sausage maker, we just focus on being a better sausage maker so we can make more money. Yeah. And that's problematic. Again, not condoning Aristotle's society and slavery, but condoning that the point about needing virtue to give us something more to do than figuring out we can sell more.
How to commodify more things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very contemporary application of what Moore is doing here in this social exercise.
But then Moore, the character in this story, or at least in this part, he kind of says, but I am of a contrary opinion. He's like, I don't think you can do that, right? He sort of steps back, and I think he says, well, if the commons don't gel with this, or at least what if people... I think he was talking about the idea of the rights being infringed upon. I think, right, that you can't necessarily have something, like if you make something of your own merit, or I guess of your own hands, I guess he says, that you can't keep it. So then it almost sounds like he's saying, like, well, then we're going to get into this state of nature, a la Locke or anything like that, where I think he says, like, shall there not there of necessity be continual sedition and bloodshed? Right? Like, there's just going to be this constant give and take that people are going to be stealing from other people. And
he's also worried about if property is communally shared. I think he worries that people will get, I think it's on 38 in my edition, that I think he worries that people will get lazy, I think is the...
Yes, because if somebody labors and then they don't get what they labored, or if you receive what other people have labored for, then why are you going to bother?
The hope of gain does not spur him on, and by relying on others, he will become lazy. it's nice to know individualism existed even even back then.
Yeah.
This is an old problem.
Right.
What's interesting about that is I think it's some of the Scandinavian countries have the highest rates of entrepreneurship in the world per capita. Like, or they have a very good entrepreneur success rate. I find that interesting in a democratic socialist world where, in theory, they should all be lazy and I guess dying of their laziness or something. I don't know.
Right, and that's what Hitler takes. He says like, wait. I mean, he doesn't use Scandinavia, but he says like
this Utopia.
But Utopia, though, that's what he sort of mentions. He's like, well, you can say that. He's like, I'm not surprised that you say that more, but if you saw Utopia, you would understand how this could work.
Yeah.
Right. So that he's baiting him on, and he's kind of getting him out more his appetite watered in some respect because he's like, oh my gosh, like now I want to find out. About Utopia, right? And then
it sets it up.
It sets it up so well, and then he says, "Well, we'll talk about it soon after." It wasn't like after they ate or something like that, and then they retire back.
Which in that ending, he notes that the Utopians, because the question becomes like, we've been civilized for a while. How come the Utopians have discovered these things, and we haven't? And one of the reasons is because the Utopians seem to predate modern society. Yeah. But he also says they have a willingness to learn that we don't have. Which
is brought up in the beginning, right? Yeah. That you're talking about. Yeah, we don't want to learn.
So it's like, I think it's like they have a Roman or Greek show up, and it's like they learned everything from them because they're so dedicated to learning this.
Right.
But yeah, there's also the interesting thing of Hythloday. This is where you see that Plato-Aristotle dichotomy, because he says, I would never have left Utopia except to come back and let it be known to others. It almost is like this Plato's cave thing. Like, no, there is this ideal world if you would just leave your freaking cave, man.
But then there's that dichotomy again of like, I can do that, but at the same time, like, I can't.
Well, it's the Aristotle.
Yeah, I can't espouse those. Yeah, I can't be an Aristotle I can't be an Aristotle and espouse those traits because I'm going to muddy them. But in some way, he finds it fine to talk to more about it.
Well, even the muddying them, even to the fact that like, still the question of like practical possibility. Like, and again, it's this is one of the things I like about Utopia is it wrestles with the ideal and also the practical of what can be done now, and it understands that tension of the ideal and what can practically be done now. And I think as a work of fiction, it's better than laying out a political theory of government that you're trying, or of economics that you're trying to put forward. But that no human being in their existence can ever fit into a system perfectly.
Yeah, and I think we talked off camera about having the dialogue, or maybe I think we talked on camera about having this structure of a dialogue, and like you said, fiction, but of two people talking about this, and one saying, "Are you serious? This seems kind of impractical," and the other saying, "Well, no, it's actually something that can happen," and having that, we see that tension personified really nicely, which, I mean, it happens all the time. We're always talking to some people on both sides, you know, whether it's a libertarian or a communist or whatever. Everybody's like, that's not practical.
When's the last time you talked to a communist? When's the last time you talked to a communist?
I'm talking about other people's lives, not
sure.
my own.
You might talk to communists or socialists or various...
Oh, no, but of any leaning, there's an argument, a common argument I think I see is impracticality. That could never work.
Yeah.
That could never happen.
And it fits any spectrum, any idea of what what the good society looks like. Yeah. No, that's a good point.
Yeah, and that this is brought up here, but then we get the, little monkey wrench where it's like, actually it did happen. Not really happen, like, fictionally, of course, but I'm going to show you a society that actually did do this.
Yeah, which will be book 2.
Yeah.
Which will be discussed sometime in December.
Before the release date.
Before the release date of before 2017, because it'll be in December, and then definitely before we ever get back to Kant's religion within the bounds of mere reason. So do you have anything else you want to say before we sign off?
No, I think we've set up book 2 nicely, and I can't wait to find out what Utopia is like.
Yeah, have you read that part yet?
No.
Yeah. And then maybe next time Jordan Klein will be able to join us and talk all about Cicero, which there's plenty of Cicero, Seneca, all these different Roman philosophers in here.
I mean, we're dealing with a Renaissance humanist.
Yeah, which Jordan would have been a great person to talk about, but she didn't. So if you have any complaints, you can send them to Jordan Klein at Noetic, and just let her know that you were disappointed by this presentation, and send all those her way.
Yeah, and to do so, you can download the app, which is also on Google Play and the App Store, or you could also leave a comment on the YouTube or SoundCloud page. So thank you all very much, Matt. It's a pleasure as always.
Always. And
we'll see you all next time when we delve into the actual Utopia.
Bye, everybody.
Take care, y'all.